This is Questions of Courage, a podcast from the youth section at the Goetheanum, hosted by Nathaniel Williams.
Welcome to Questions of Courage. In the last episode, I was speaking about aesthetic education and Goethe's orientations and contributions to natural scientific method. And at the end, I commented on the fact that this isn't only of historical relevance, but something that is deeply inspiring for the situation that we find ourselves in today. And I still think that it's helpful to contrast this orientation towards common sense and towards knowledge based on experience and perception with the way it is being spoken of in the United States, for instance, that a revolution of common sense is at hand, and that this way of talking about common sense is connected with a rise in nationalism, of economic development and competition without a real respect and awareness for the limitations of our shared planet and ecology. And I mentioned at the end of the podcast that the emergence of the modern environmental movement, it's been shown, was connected to this scientific orientation that Goethe developed as it lived on, primarily through the influence of Rudolf Steiner's work and students of anthroposophy and Goethe's approach to science. And this has been shown or suggested and shown in a remarkable book by Dan McCannon called Eco-Alchemy. And the subtitle of the book is Anthroposophy and the History and Future of Environmentalism. And I'm going to just quote briefly from this book, page 175, Ecology, the beginning of the chapter. And Dan McCannon writes, "The preceding chapters have demonstrated that anthroposophy has profoundly shaped the environmental movement throughout its evolution. Without the yeasty contributions of anthroposophical initiatives, there might have been no organic agriculture, no campaign to ban DDT, no community-supported agriculture, and no environmental banks. At a minimum, each of those pillars of environmentalism would be profoundly different without anthroposophy." And in this short quote that I've read, Dan McCannon brings up environmental banks. And I already mentioned the reference to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and how much of the evidence that informed her book was connected with a correspondence with a biodynamic gardener. You can learn more about that in Dan McCannon's book. Today, though, I don't want to deepen or expand on that particular part of a school of common sense or a revolution of common sense. In this direction I'm trying to characterize, I don't want to focus on Goethe's scientific method. I do want to, just in the outset, recall, for those of you who listened to the last podcast, it's good to bring back to mind, for those of you who haven't, maybe this can be helpful in what follows, that Goethe also saw in science a possibility of educating our sensibilities or our feelings, and different possibilities of educating our feelings and sensibility than with art. And through natural science, in the way that he developed it, encouraged it, it's possible to feel reverence for the limits of the phenomenal world and awe for the limits of the phenomenal world, meaning also natural phenomena in the natural world, to feel a certain stability and givenness and a kind of foundation for life that is connected with the phenomenal world. So knowledge through perception. This is a attitude and an inner orientation that I think it's fair to say we need more of, and we need to find ways of educating. And this bigger picture of education of common sense, or an education of aesthetic experience. And we should remember that aesthetic was chosen as a word when it was introduced in the modern era because aesthetic expressed knowledge gained through experience or perception. It was not narrowly focused on art and beauty as it has come to be in the last 150, 200 years. So this school of common sense, of aesthetic education, this bigger picture that it's not only about art and the humanities, but it's also about kind of phenomenological natural science, is not only a kind of loose suggestion, a speculative, vague idea, but something that Goethe worked out in a remarkable way, and that there are researchers today, as I mentioned before, my colleagues in the natural science section, also former colleagues who are active at the Nature Institute in upstate New York. For those of you who are not familiar with that institute and you want to get to know contemporary Goetheanistic research, I encourage you to look at their website and resources. But today, I'd like to turn towards a truly, truly exciting dimension of this school of common sense, and it was developed by Rudolf Steiner, and it's connected to the emergence of anthroposophical, so the environmental banks that Dan McCannon refers to, and which he has a chapter dedicated to in Eco-Alchemy. And it's also connected to the emergence of the community-supported agricultural movement. This is really such a fascinating topic. It touches on core dilemmas and tensions in it also is really interesting if you look at the person who developed it, who was Rudolf Steiner, and how slowly it emerged. Rudolf Steiner, as an ethical philosopher, when he was in his 20s and 30s, was almost entirely focused on the experience of freedom and individuation, and what you could even call a kind of anarchistic or libertarian orientation to action. That in the end, it was individual will impulses and the motivations of individual will impulses of people that arose not out of experience or moral dogmas or teachings from a church, but out of a kind of enthusiasm and idealism that were the most important dimension of ethical life. And of course, the most well-known work from him in this regard is his Philosophy of Freedom. And when you read this work, it's really interesting. I mean, it's a wonderful work. But if you read it and you try to look for any suggestions of cooperative economics or economics in general, any also honoring of the challenge of economics, you will be disappointed because it's just not there. And indeed, the few years after he wrote the Philosophy of Freedom, if you look in his autobiography, which the years after the appearance of the Philosophy of Freedom until the end of the century, so between 1894 and 1900, he also started trying to have conversations with political thinkers and social reformers about what are the societal implications of a philosophy of freedom. What would it require for an organization of society? And at this time in his life, he associates with an anarchist named John Henry Mackay. He aligns himself with Max Stirner and also with Nietzsche. And there is a very strong strain of individualism in his work. And in his autobiography, he indicates that this led to a kind of crisis when he tried to apply his ethical philosophy, his young ethical philosophy, to a kind of imagination of structuring society. It really led to a crisis for him. And it wasn't until, for decades later, so 1919 to 1923, that he really was able to come to a more mature political social philosophy that also embraced, for instance, economics. And most especially his course, Rethinking Economics, is the title of the current edition in English that he delivered to economics students in 1922. So a little bit of a background, really interesting to follow, because when Rudolf Steiner was young, he wasn't only writing the Philosophy of Freedom, but he was also editing Goethe's natural scientific works. And here we see a remarkable transformation. He edits, before the end of the 19th century, Rudolf Steiner edits Goethe's natural scientific work. He becomes deeply familiar with the method of intuitive understanding that I described in the last podcast, and the virtues of it, and this kind of bigger view of aesthetic education. Schiller had a view that was really just focused on art and the humanities, but with Goethe you had someone who had an understanding of aesthetic education that embraced art, the humanities, and natural science. And it is only with Steiner that this aesthetic education reaches its culmination, I want to suggest, when he develops his theory of associative economics. Now, I'm not going to talk about the threefold social order in the bigger picture of social threefolding in this podcast episode, but I want to just focus on associative economics because Rudolf Steiner explicitly, in the question and answer seminar sessions of his economics course from 1922, he explicitly connects associative economics with Goethe's method of intuitive understanding. And he shares how it was through this that he was able to develop a picture of social, cooperative, associative economic life that was not based on national economies or just regional economies or homesteading, but fully modern economy on a global level that worked against national egotism and which really raised into consciousness the ecological conditions and limitations of economic activity and the social conditions and realities of everyone who's involved in economic life. That's producers, people creating things, distributors, people who are moving things around to the places where they are needed, and consumers, which is all of us, of course. In this episode, I'm going to focus on true price because it is so intriguing to look at how what Goethe does in natural science, where he tries to observe a phenomena in the most varied situations and to alter conditions and create experiments where you can see all the different ways that, say, color comes to appearance. And only through that great variety do you arrive at an insight of the lawfulness that is creatively, intrinsically active in all of color experience. And this he describes as the primal phenomenon, which, again, if you want to hear more about that, the last episode was dedicated to it. The characteristic feature, though, that I want to highlight right now is only through making many, many, many infinite observations and then getting them in the right order can you begin to understand the idea that unites them all, the intrinsic creative idea that is expressing itself through all of those particularities. Now, how does this inspire Rudolf Steiner's associative economics? Well, when you enter into economics as compared to natural science, you're entering a social science. And immediately when we enter social science, we have to do with practical philosophy, so with ethics, questions of ethics. And the economic life is in one way one of the most basic expressions of collective social life. Right above biology, you have the beginning of social collective life with the economy, which is the meeting of our most basic needs through cooperation. Rudolf Steiner sees that this orientation of Goethe actually has an ethical potential in it. And it leads to his vision of association as a verb in the modern economy. Now, the modern economy is characterized by the division of labor, where any article or commodity that we find, you can usually trace it back to contributions from groups and individuals in many different places around the world that contributed some way to a commodity. It could be a t-shirt, it could be a car, It could be an electronic device. When you look at a commodity and you really are able to look through the commodity and see everyone involved in creating it, you would see the ecological conditions where resources are taken, material is taken from nature, and the transformation of nature through labor, but also through ingenuity in the emergence of a commodity. And these groups of people that are working together on these commodities, they speak different languages, they live in different countries, they have different religions, but they're all working together somehow in this most basic global dimension of collective life. And Rudolf Steiner thought that this global dimension of collective life had to be accepted and acknowledged in modern society, but it came with a huge challenge and a huge potential. And the challenge was that because we only participate in very small moments of economic life, so for instance, we might even just contribute a very small part in a value chain, an economic value chain. We might do a very small action that in, for instance, the production of a t-shirt. So we might be involved in working at the factory where the cotton is spun. And that's the only thing that we are involved in, is creating cotton thread for garments and the garment industry. And we really don't know anything else about the value chain necessarily. So, and when you picture everyone kind of working in such a specialized way, they're alienated from the bigger process of production and consumption. Now, this leads to a huge amount of productive capacity through the division of labor. The material production that we can achieve through working together, the output is incomparable to what we can do if we work alone. For instance, in homesteading, or where you will do many steps in the production process and complete a whole, let's say, garment yourself. Incomparable. And Rudolf Steiner, one of his challenges that he set himself, that he saw was a challenge, was how can we facilitate overcoming this alienation from both the ecological context that plays a part in all economic activity, but the social context too. So how can we get all these perspectives to enter into the individual places in the value chain where people are active, so that they can make judgments about the value of things that they're involved in producing and consuming. And so he suggested that associations be created. Now, associations for him were a group of people who could produce, distribute, but also were interested in using or consuming some economic commodity, and that they would share from their own insight and their own needs of what was economically possible and make plans for economic projects and enterprises. Now, it's important to point out that Rudolf Steiner, from the outset, suggests that the framing of economic life should be cooperative, that it's not competitive, but it's cooperative, that when associations are formed, the basic intention is to work together to take care of everyone's needs as best as possible in economic projects of production, distribution, and consumption. And it's not about making individual fortunes or competing to undercut other people, but in working together in a kind of humanitarian spirit, or a kind of social bargaining process where you weigh what's possible and what's needed, and you come up with plans that you can execute together. Now, this is important because this is where Rudolf Steiner parts ways with the framing of many economic thinkers. His justification for this is really inspiring, and it's something that, of course, other economists have noted, which is that the modern economy is characterized by cooperation. I've already talked about that a little bit, but basically, when you look at the economy, what you see is that everyone is working to meet other people's needs. That's basically what the modern economy has developed into. It, as Rudolf Steiner says, precludes egotism. But the way we think about it doesn't preclude egotism. And this is where Rudolf Steiner emphasized the importance of reframing economic life as a socially oriented, cooperative endeavor. So with that framing, which we find, echoed behavioral economics today, the importance of framing has been underlined, particularly in relationship to cooperation versus competition. But even in the work of someone like Elinor Ostrom and Governing the Commons, for those of you who are familiar with her work, Nobel Prize winner in economics, she criticizes the analysis of the commons that excludes this kind of natural cooperative orientation, which actually people are engaged in more than they might believe, and definitely more than the mainstream economists believe. So Rudolf Steiner suggests this framing as well, as implicit in the modern economy, as an ethical potential that if we can think it and align our thinking with it, we can unleash the virtue not of liberty, but the virtue of fraternity. So just a little bit of a backdrop there, and now I want to come back and to speak about this connection with Goethe's intuitive understanding. So how does Goethe's method look when it becomes an ethical philosophy? Well, Rudolf Steiner reflects on the fact that when you have these associations where everyone in a value chain is trying to share their value judgments and insights based on their knowledge of the natural conditions where they live, so their bioregions, the availability of natural resources, but also expertise related to sustainability, which local knowledge often is more aware of than, let's say, transnational corporations. So when everyone is sharing their value judgments, and through sharing all of these different value judgments, it's possible to determine something that Rudolf Steiner calls true price. And true price is a price that reflects the ecological or natural, regulative or democratically legislated laws related to safety and working time, etc., and social needs of each point in the value chain as best as possible. Working towards having a true price would mean that everyone in the value chain would receive enough income that they could take care of themselves, all of their dependents, and live a dignified life. Of course, the definition of a dignified life has to be understood as an ideal towards which one would strive in different places. Ultimately, that would be understood differently. But that the value judgment reflected in true price would only arise if all the different moments in value chain informed true price. And then each point in the value chain, the income would be there, which allowed for the person to take care of themselves until they could create another commodity and once again receive income. And so this picture of a kind of social determination of true price. And for those of you who know the CSA movement, or Community Supported Agricultural Movement, which I mentioned earlier in reference to Dan McCannon's book, is one example often which excludes distributors, where you just have producers, so farmers and consumers, coming together in this social spirit of enterprise. Which has been hugely impactful not only in the United States but around the world. This is one example of this this kind of culture, and it goes back to Rudolf Steiner. And so what we find is that Rudolf Steiner's engagement with intuitive understanding and the primal phenomenon when he was a young man, and the crisis in his at the end of the century when he didn't feel that his ethical philosophy could be really a mature starting point for a structuring of society. Decades later, it's not necessarily the work on the philosophy of freedom that brings him further, but his work with Goethe's natural scientific judgment. And this becomes his associative economics. And he is explicit about this connection. but he also emphasizes in the conversations coming to true price, it's really important that they have a pictorial character, that they're not spreadsheets of numbers, but that people are talking about their value judgments based on experience, on perception, as much as possible, very pictorial, grounded, we could say phenomenological. That's a pretty expensive word for something like that. Value judgments. And so Rudolf Steiner develops a kind of ethical aesthetic judgment, and he situates it within economic life as one of the most important capacities for a cooperative, ecologically and socially informed economic modern economy. So what is true price in economics is a kind of metamorphosis of what is the primal phenomenon in Goethe's natural scientific works. And in philosophy, there are different ways that this is approached. But generally speaking, there's an acknowledgement of theoretical philosophy, which really is concerned with describing what is, and practical philosophy, which is describing what we want to do or what we ought to do. So with science and ethics. And here we see this beautiful transition from Goethean intuitive understanding as a kind of theoretical philosophy and associative economics as a neighboring practical philosophy, so ethical philosophy. But they are so connected. Their connection is in part due to the fact that the economy is so connected to the natural world, and that economic judgments are conditioned by ecological and environmental realities as well as social realities. And when we see, for instance, in Dan McKinnon's study, that this school of common sense or aesthetic education that we can trace back to Goethe also had this financial or economic dimension that goes back to Rudolf Steiner, we can see that this focus on knowledge of perception, not only for theory, but also particularly for ethical, economic, cooperative life, go hand in hand. And when we look back in a huge arc over a couple hundred centuries, we can find Alexander Baumgarten is in a tradition where perception is still a source of knowledge, and in England, perception is also, and taste are a source of ethical action. And Kant comes in and he separates perception and he separates experience from both knowledge and ethics. But at the same time, there's this new impulse that starts with Goethe and I would say culminates with Steiner over about 150 years, where perception is connected again with knowledge in natural science, and perception is also connected with ethics in the form of modern associative economics. And that this is not just of historical interest, I hope to have already made clear. And for those of you who want to learn more, not from this kind of bigger theoretical perspective, but from the field, Dan McKinnon, who's not an anthroposophist himself, but professor at Harvard, has really taken an interest in this and really made some remarkable contributions to understanding this kind of revolution of common sense, where it's not so much about developing common sense towards national egotism, towards economic competition, instead developing common sense to ecological solidarity, a respect for the limits of nature, and an orientation of a social economic life, modern economic life. I am convinced that this not only had relevance for the emergence of the environmental movement, the modern environmental movement, but there's a huge potential in this revolution of common sense. And I hope that something of that has been able to be communicated in these last two episodes. Questions of Courage is a very modest project. The production costs are quite low. And I do want to invite you to consider making a contribution. All the money that comes in related to the podcast goes towards youth work. In the youth department where I'm active, the School for Spiritual Science at the Goethe. Thank you.